Thank you.
It's funny as you were reading this. First of all, I only had a grandfather, my dad's father. My parents were from two different small communities in Oklahoma, and I can remember as a child, my parents at the end of school year taking my siblings and I down to my grandfather's home in a little rural community in Oklahoma, and there we would be for the summer until school started. Mm-hmm. And I was envisioning some of those moments with my grandfather, and one that stuck out most was I was 15, and my dad had told my grandfather that I could drive. Now, my experience driving was sometimes with my dad in his Chevy Impala that was automatic. My grandfather had a 1955 Chevy Bel Air stick on a collar.
Yeah, stick on the collar.
So right. And I remember this like it was yesterday. I had to take him to the nearest city where his doctor was. And so my grandfather was under the pretense that I could drive. And as we are going down this little road, I'm trying to negotiate how to shift. It was something else. But it was one of those scenarios where you had to assimilate quickly, you know what I mean? Or all hell's about to break loose. So somehow I managed to drive, to put the thing in gear and drive. And when we were coming back from taking my grandfather to his doctor, as we're pulling into the house, there were two metal fences on both sides of the driveway, and I missed hitting one of the metal fences about that much. But I mean that had stuck with me all my life, and it's funny as you're reading this, thoughts of being with my grandfather started to come. I don't know if you all went there mentally, but it's like we all have similar experiences. Mm-hmm. It just depends on where we are and who we're with. Yep. But this is a story that's applicable to any. That's not culturally significant. This is a life experience.
Yeah, that's the thing about it. And that's why I say that's why stories transcend. Because when I talk about muscadines, had so many people say, "Yeah, I used to pick muscadines growing up and stuff like that." And we used to be in the woods and we would pick them all the time. And when I was in high school, a friend of mine, I don't know if some of y'all are old enough to remember these commercials used to come on TV about Ronco. The Ronco this and the Ronco that. Right. Well, there was a Ronco winemaking kit.
Wow.
And one of my friends decided he was going to make muscadine wine. And so we went out and we picked those muscadines and we did everything the kit told us to do. And we waited the months we were supposed to wait. And, and then he finally took it out and we poured it in a glass and that stuff was like straight vinegar. I don't think my lips have been that tight since. But it's stuff like that, we came from rural folks. My father's people were from Seal, Alabama. They grew up on a farm. Mm-hmm. My mother's people were farmers out in Midland, Georgia. Grandfather owned the land and stuff like that. We had 24 aunts and uncles total, and so the country was in us. Right. Some of us liked it more than other ones. I enjoyed it. My dream was when I graduated from college to buy me a Jeep and a bass boat and hunting, fish, and all that kind of stuff. Right. But then I came to Atlanta and got cityfied. Right. But it's stuff that I feel like I don't see people talk about as much. We also grew up during the Civil Rights Movement. We were the first group of people in Columbus that actually experienced integration in schools. Right. My whole world was black until I was 12 years old, and and there were things that we went through because of that. Stuff that I don't see people talk about.
What do you think that is?
I don't know. I think it's because I think sometimes people focus on the big picture. Just like when we look at the young kids who were integrating schools back in the 50s, and we talk about what they were doing and talk about how strong they were, but we really don't talk about what they were going through. Right. To be a child that young and having to be subject to that kind of hate. Right. By the time we did it in the 70s, things had tempered a bit, but we still had we were still subject to those misconceptions of who we were and what we were capable of doing and stuff like that.
Right.
And I don't think we talk about that. I mean, there's another book in me somewhere that's going to talk about that from a more serious point.
Sure.
But this was kind of like breaking me in to that, just looking at those childhood experiences and finding a way to tell them in a way that would be different. But I still feel like there's another book to be written that would talk about those experiences more seriously, and some of the things that I experienced doing that, and some of the things that my friends experienced doing that, and some of the things that we were told were true that were, and some of the things we were told were true that weren't, you know, and that kind of thing. But yeah, yes.
So this is totally different from the other writings you've done from a science fiction standpoint. Do you see yourself moving away from that and going more into this type of writing, more nonfiction type of writings?
Actually, I do. There was a time I didn't think I would do it, but as I get older,
Right.
and you know, I hate to say it, but as I get older and I start to lose family members, and those memories tend to become more precious.
Yes.
And just if it's just because to leave something that people can read and just relate to, and you know, 20, 30 years from now when things are entirely different, you know, to kind of get a feel for that. So I see it happening more and more. That's why this book was written, because, you know, I see myself thinking about these stories more and more now, and reflecting on that lifestyle and how we grew up, and you know, how it was different than now, but at the same time how it's, you know, the same as now, you know, because it's just and these, I guess as authors would understand, these are just stories that I feel like I have to tell. So
Right.
you know, I can see it. I see myself getting away that inspiration to write science fiction fantasy these days is not as strong as it is for me to write stories based on personal experience and our history as Black people. And stuff.
Right. Well, that seems natural. That at this point in your life, there are more stories within your spirit that you want to reconnect with.
Yeah, I guess I would say it like that. That's kind of like it's just trying to, you know, reconcile things, and just making sure that things aren't forgotten.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
you know that things that somebody may one day come across a book and say, hey, you know, I'm from Columbus, Georgia, or I was born in Seal, Alabama. You know,
Right.
because perfect example is when me and my dad would go down there all the time, and I just assumed that all the woods and everything like that would look like that all the time.
Right.
And one day I just asked him, I said, well, was it always like this? He said, no, I wasn't a tree around. He said, all this was cotton fields.
Wow.
He said, all this was cotton fields, you know.
Wow.
And I'm looking at it, I'm thinking at this time, like, oh, so this is recent. This is not something, this hasn't been woods all the time and stuff like that, you know. So stuff like that I would assume was one way. But then and I think that's something that we don't do enough of, is talk to our elders and listen to them, you know. And sometimes I think about the few times I did talk to them and they told us about stuff, and it gives you a better idea of what they went through and what they grew up with, stuff like that, you know. So, and how in some ways things are better for us, but in some things they're not. Some ways they're not, you know.
In your probably inquiring with some of the older spirits, have you found them to be somewhat reluctant in sharing some of their past, growing up in a Jim Crow era, and not wanting to revisit any emotional angst that they've experienced?
I say yes and no. I mean, some people know, because as we know, as we get older, we love to talk. You know, young people are rolling their eyes when we start talking. But there are times when I would talk to my father that he would tell me stories about growing up in Seal, Alabama, and most of them was like, you know, carefree type stuff.
Right.
But every now and then he would tell me a story that was like kind of deep, you know, and I would sit down and he would it would kind of give you an idea of what they went through from a negative standpoint.
Sure.
It's something if I probably asked him about it, he probably wouldn't say it, but if I'm just sitting there listening to him, he would talk about my mother as well, you know. So, now my mother's their family. I call her side of the family storytellers. They love to tell stories, you know.
Okay.
If I was to say I got it from anybody, it'd be from that side of the family. But yeah, it's I think as they get older, when we were younger, they wouldn't tell us anything, you know. But as they got older, they would talk about things that they probably weren't proud of, or different things like that. But it took time. It took time.
I can only imagine because I think about some of the things my parents would share with me and some of the things they held back and probably revealed as I got older and probably had a better chance of understanding about growing up in rural Oklahoma. In fact, my mom is from Boley, Oklahoma, one of the only black founded towns in Oklahoma. And her people, like many folk from Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, Kansas, migrated to the West Coast during the Depression for agricultural jobs. And so those are many stories to be told from that experience alone.
Yeah.
But once again, as I'm listening, as you're reading your story here, I can remember going back and reliving some of those moments in rural Oklahoma with my grandfather. And and my aunt, my dad's sister. And some of it was memorable, some of it was not so. But I mean, it lends itself to the fact that this is life. This is life.
That's right.
We all have, everyone in here has probably a story or two they can relate to and talk about. Was that cue card? Questions from any of you? Sure.
I have a comment. I just love this story. My daddy was a sharecropper from Mississippi.
What part?
He had near Winona, Baby,
Okay.
Mississippi. Winona, where they beat Fannie Lou Hamer.
Ah, okay.
His hands were so big
Yeah.
and calloused.
Uh-huh.
And it was like you said, the yellow circles. It was
Wow.
like the calluses never really left, right?
Wow.
He could take a hot coal out of the fireplace
What?
and light his cigarettes.
Oh, I'm scared of him.
Yeah, but it's that idea, you know, that
Yeah.
the hand becomes a site of memory.
Yeah.
And that's part of what you're
Yeah.
doing for us.
Yeah.
My uncles, you know, I never thought about them working on the farm and how strong they became. There was one time when one reason I stopped going on the farm because when I got to be a teenager, they started putting me to work. And then every time they see me, come over here, boy, you know, come over here, boy, you know. And so one day we were over there and they were separating the hogs. I'm not gonna tell you why because it's a long story. And so our job, me and my cousin, and he's a lot better than me, was that we had to grab the hogs and bring them over there to him. And I'm watching them, and they're like grabbing these hogs and they're dragging them around. And so I said, okay, Uncle's grabbing the hogs. You know, I'm 15 years old and stuff. You know, I go over and I grab this hog by the leg, and that hog dragged me around this pen. And I'm like, so they said, well, you know, you just go over here and stand over there because you can't handle this kind of stuff. But it's just, you know, just being, you know, the things that they had to do on the farm. You know, people say they want to live on the farm, you know, but that's hard. That's hard work. That's hard work.
My question is around the stories that you've chosen to place in the book. I have not read the book, but I'm sure based on lived experience as well with your ancestors and your family. But also, are they driven by a value system that you hold dear? For example, this story of your grandfather and learning about him certainly is the love of family. Mm-hmm. Is there another set of themes that are driving the stories other than what you can remember?
I think family is a big part of it because that's something that I see actually that pops up in my fiction, my science fiction and fantasy. When I look back at the stories I write in science fiction and fantasy, that's something I don't write about solitary characters. Every time I write about a character, it's a group of people, and I think it's because I grew up around family. You know, I mean, like I said, I had 24 aunts and uncles. had cousins. We divided ourselves by age groups. There was so many of us, and you played with the cousins that were in your age group, and you didn't mess with the other ones, and that kind of stuff like that, And so that's something that's always been really important to me about it. And I think another thing is part of being black is perseverance. We find when I think about us being here, we are basically the descendants of people who survived the Middle Passage, and so to me that puts inside of us a sense of survival and perseverance to be able to do something like that when you could do nothing to help make your situation better but survive it. And when I look at my parents and my grandparents and stuff like that, I kind of see that same thing in them. That's why when I was in school and people say, well, talk about your heroes, I would always talk about my family, people in my family, because to me, I felt like that's what they were. Because to be able to go through what they went through and to be able to sacrifice for us so we could go to college and stuff, knowing that they weren't going to get these opportunities, they were just like, well, that's not for us. I tell my wife, I didn't even think you could not go to college. That's the way my parents raised. I thought that was my only choice, So that's kind of like, so I think that's kind of like, I would say family is a big thing, and just perseverance, that kind of comes from, growing up in that environment.
Question. So she said you've been hoping for historical fiction or historical nonfiction. Have you reported on StoryCorps? Are you familiar with StoryCorps?
Actually, I have. Matter of fact, with this gentleman right there, Ed Hall, with my wife and I've done a StoryCorps. And when we talked about it, we talked about the 70s and the 60s growing up in Columbus, Georgia, where we were from, and some of the stuff we had to deal with about that. But that is something that we have done.
A Georgia story, right? And it's intergenerational. It gives folks like me who are from the North deeper understanding of how things worked here and how the history was shared. My question is, you mentioned that your next book may be along this genre rather than Afrofuturism type book. Is there a possibility of kind of bringing the two together?
It's possible. I mean, I think that Afrofuturism comes from, it comes from, you're finding many definitions of it, but it comes from our experience as African Americans. When you think about some of the people who are considered the founders of Afrofuturism, like Sun Ra and different like that, when they were doing this stuff like that, they didn't call it that. For them, it was just science fiction. It was their interpretation of science fiction, and we labeled it. We put a name onto it when I think his name was Michael Derry. He was trying to explain what people like Sun Ra and Earth, Wind, and Fire was doing, and that's where they came up with the name of Afrofuturism. And Afrofuturism tends to circle around that black experience within this futuristic backdrop and stuff. Not everything that I write is Afrofuturism. Like Sword and Soul and some of the science fiction I write. So I could see that. I guess the best way to say it will depend on whether or not I see a story or a story comes to me in that fashion. I don't usually write. I don't usually write to be toward a certain type of genre. I just kind of write my stories, and after I'm finished with them, then I'll look at them and say, well, hey, this is a good science fiction story, or this is a good horror story, or this might be a good Afrofuturism story, So I can't say I won't, but at the same time, I can't say I will, because it just depends on how it hits me and how passionate I guess I feel about it.
Any other questions for the author?
For someone that's not familiar with your science fiction, what would you recommend as an entryway?
That's the hardest question for an author to answer. Well, I guess I'll say it depends on what you're interested in. If you're interested in, like, my Sword and Soul, which is basically sword and sorcery based on African history and culture, I'd say start from my first book, Meji. It was after I'd done a lot of research on African history and culture, I wanted to write a story that would deal with heroes from that background, and that's where that book came from. If you're interested in more science fiction, I have a novella that I just let out recently called Playing the Odds, which is if you've heard of cyberpunk, it's actually a cyberpunk novel. Think of, let me see what would be a good example of cyberpunk you may or may not have heard of. Blade Runner, something like that, more along that kind of lines and stuff, I write something called steampunk, which is basically steampunk with African standpoint. I have a book called From Here to Timbuktu, which is actually it's what we call alternate history. It's based on the premise that what if the Haitian Revolution had spread to American South and had been successful? And so it's based on a country called Fredonia, which is basically run by emancipated slaves or emancipated Africans. And it kind of reimagines what the world would look like, what North America would look like if that had happened, And I write stories from that background and stuff. So, again, it depends on what your interests might be, which would be the book to start with. It's kind of hard for me to say.
Is there a place, a website, or something that we can go to buy your books?
Well, right here, starting here, 44th and 3rd, you can purchase books here. I also have a website as well, MV Media, where I sell my books and stuff. I have over 43 titles available and stuff like that.
What's that site again?
It's mvmediaatl.com. But that's my main site where I sell most of my stuff.
What are some of the titles you have available today?
Well, that's a good variety of stuff. Of course, there's Muscadine Wine, which is my short story collection. There's Black Rose, which is actually a historical fiction story that takes place in East Africa and Japan. Really, I wanted to look at that from a different perspective. Terminus, which is a collection of short stories by myself and our group Atlanta Futurism, where some of the authors are actually in the audience. Ed Hall, Jessica Cage, Daryl, all of those are authors in that story as well. And Amber in the Hidden City, which is a middle grade book about a African American girl who finds out she's the only person that can pick the king of an African kingdom that's been hidden from the rest of the world for 1,000 years. So, like you see, I write a variety of stuff, And
it's good that we were talking about that, because I'm sure the number's large in terms of African Americans not knowing of African American writers, and they're out there, and it's up to us to make sure that we spread the word of the people we see here today, and that they exist, and a lot of young spirits need to be told that you can be a writer. You can express yourself that way, and you don't have to go the traditional route of careers. And the more we, as older spirits, are able to penetrate their thought patterns about the possibilities, the better off we all can be. I'm sure everybody agrees with that. So, yeah. In closing.
Thank you for coming. Get some books. But thank y'all for coming, really.
Thank you.